Hello, everyone, and welcome to the pilot episode of the Frills and Fury podcast, where we're all about being poised and elegant while listening to some foul, gut-wrenching beats. I'm your host, Emma Jacobs, and in the next 4 months, you can expect to be introduced to 15 of my all-time favorite metal albums that I feel pull all aspects of the subgenre in, except for screamo and that guttural growl BS that some of you like. Here's a quick rundown of the albums and respective bands that we will be covering in that time. First, we start strong in 1991 with Primus's Sailing the Seas of Cheese, followed by Tool's album Undertow, released in 93. Then the year after, Euthanasia by Megadeth and an album called Groove Family Psycho by Infectious Grooves. Week 5, we will talk about Pantera's The Great Southern Trendkill album from 96, and then Rammstein's Schenschut release in 97. From the same year, we will look at Snot's Get Some album, and then jump to the turn of the century with Kitty's Pissed Off Spit. Next, we go to the Height of Callousness album by Spineshank, and then jump to 2002 with System of a Down released Steal This Album. Then we will cover one of my personal favorite albums of all time, Life is Killing Me by Typo Negative, one of the heaviest, most beautiful metal compositions I've come across. Then for the Gen Xers, we will cover Deftones' well-loved 2012 album Diamond Eyes, and then Gojira's L'Enfant Sauvage, coming out in 2012. However, I saved the best for last, and today we're going to kick off the series by diving deep into the one and only legendary Slipknot. Nobody does it quite like this group of maniacs. They were born in Des Moines, Iowa in 1995 out of frustration rather than ambition. Percussionist Sean Clown Cron and bassist Paul Gray had been grinding through a dead-end local metal scene with nothing to show for it. Drummer Joey Jordison joined soon after, and the three became the creative core. The band cycled through several vocalists and guitarists over the next 2 years before Cron, in the now legendary story, walked into a Des Moines adult shop in 97 and recruited the clerk behind the counter, a 23-year-old Corey Taylor, who was fronting another local band called Stone Sour on the side. Taylor auditioned by rewriting the lyrics to an existing song on the spot, and Jordison repeatedly turned to Cron mid-audition and said they'd have to kill him if they didn't get him. Guitarist Mick Thompson and Jim Root, turntablist Sid Wilson, sampler Craig Jones, and percussionist Chris Fenn rounded out the eventual nine-piece lineup. They recorded their debut album at Indigo Ranch Studios in Malibu in the fall of 1998, with producer Ross Robinson capturing the drums in just 3 days to preserve the raw live energy. By the time the album dropped on June 29th, 1999, they'd already been playing Ozfest, and metal would never quite be the same. 9 members sounds like a lot, and it is, but few have done it before. Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Parliament Funkadelic, and the Wu-Tang Clan are examples of other groups with that much talent, but Slipknot was the first and most prominent metal band to have this many musicians on stage. To understand why Slipknot landed the way it did in 1999, you have to understand the culture movement they walked into. By the mid-90s, grunge, the dominant voice of youth alienation, had essentially collapsed. Kurt Cobain's suicide was seen as a widely symbolic endpoint for that movement, removing its most iconic figure and exposing the darker realities behind the musician's themes. What was left was a vacuum. The anger and alienation that grunge had channeled didn't go anywhere. It just had no home. Into that vacuum came nu metal, and Slipknot arrived at its peak. Nu metal resonated with a generation of discontented youth who considered themselves disenfranchised and abandoned by the cultural state of the US around them. These were largely suburban and rural kids, exactly where Slipknot came from, with limited economic prospects and a music scene that had nothing to offer them. Des Moines, Iowa was about as far from the cultural centers of New York and Los Angeles as you could get. Then, on April 20th, 1999, just 10 weeks before Slipknot's album dropped, the Columbine High School shooting happened. The cultural fallout was enormous. In the aftermath, public figures, including politicians and the media, blamed violent video games and music for influencing the perpetrators, even though the shooters weren't fans of any of the bands being targeted. Slipknot came under particularly harsh criticism for the members' appearance and their music, with protest groups outraged by their masks, their stage antics, and their lyrical content. The media framed them as dangerous, but here's the irony. That moral panic didn't hurt them. Without the benefits of support from the press, radio, or MTV, the album became a cult item that went platinum within 3 months of release, and the music and the image guaranteed fodder for the Banner Brigade, which only deepened their cult following. Slipknot did not just make a metal album in 1999. They made the album that a specific generation of alienated American youth had been waiting for, and they released it into cultural firestorm that made them exactly as dangerous as people had feared. Slipknot did not just make heavier music. They fundamentally challenged two assumptions rock had always taken for granted: that audiences need to see a star's face, and that rage needs to be softened to be commercially viable. Rock music, from Elvis to Mick Jagger to Kurt Cobain, had always been built around the cult of the individual. The frontman's face was the product. Slipknot deliberately destroyed that logic. By assigning numbers instead of names and hiding behind these grotesque masks, they made the collective the identity rather than any one personality, eliciting the death of the rock star ego. Rather than trading one identity for another, the performers were dissolving their identities together, and that had a profound effect on how audiences related to their music. When there's no face to project onto, fans project themselves instead. The Maggots fan base, that's what Slipknot's fans call themselves, didn't worship Corey Taylor, the person. They saw themselves in the music. This connects to a social psychology concept that I learned in a class of mine. Um, Psychologist Edward Denier coined the term de-individuation, which is the abandonment of one's self-awareness when immersed in a crowd or disguise. And scholars find that when you have large anonymous groups like this, behavior becomes more extreme and boundaries dissolve. And I think that's very evident in how Slipknot portrayed themselves, and they kind of weaponized this dynamic. The masks on stage license a kind of collective catharsis in the audience, a ritual space where normal identity rules were suspended. Their concerts weren't shows in the traditional sense, as they were events. Slipknot wasn't the first mass metal band, but they're the reason covering your face became so popular in the genre. You can draw a direct line from Slipknot's 1999 debut to Ghost, who built an entire mythology around masked identities and papal costumes, to Sleep Token, currently one of the biggest acts in rock, who focus on anonymity and masked identity. The template they established in 99, that a band could be more powerful by hiding than by showing, is now an entire aesthetic movement in modern rock and metal. The second thing that Slipknot had changed was what was permissible in mainstream music. They had legitimized working class rage. By 99, even heavy music had become polished. Grunge had been co-opted by major labels, nu metal was dominated by bands flirting with hip-hop accessibility, and the metal underground was invisible to mass audiences. In retrospect, Slipknot's debut album was a major change in metal. Until then, bands were still caught up in the fallout from grunge. And while Korn and Limp Bizkit were keeping hard rock alive, there was nothing outside from the underground to challenge the old guard of Slayer, Metallica, and Megadeth with any real substance. Slipknot's anger was different in character from what came before. Grunge's alienation was largely introspective, turned inward, melancholic, and self-destructive. Slipknot's anger was outward and collective. It wasn't one sad person in a flannel shirt. It was nine masked guys screaming together about the fury of being ignored and discarded. And that distinction matters. It spoke to a specific demographic, working class kids in places like Des Moines with no cultural representation and nothing to lose. When Corey Taylor screamed, it didn't feel like a performance. I felt like a testimony. What's critically interesting is how Slipknot used that rage strategically. They understood that unfiltered aggression, packaged with a coherent visual identity and a sense of ritual, could become a commercial force. Not despite mainstream resistance, but because of it. The moral panic around the post-Columbine didn't destroy them. It became free marketing. That's a sophisticated cultural maneuver, even if it wasn't entirely conscious. Slipknot proved that you could be genuinely extreme, commercially successful, and artistically uncompromising at the same time. That combination have never quite existed before in rock music, and the landscape of heavy music ever since has been shaped by the door they kicked open in 1999. So let's dive into the much anticipated breakdown of this album. I'll stick to one song that encapsulates the energy that we've been moving for, but I wanted to point out a fun fact. The opening track of their self-titled debut album, the one that we're going to talk about, It's a long list of numbers. I'll say the first four, 7426. That's the very first noise, I'll call it noise, on this album. It was created by Craig Jones, who actually had an obsession with the Manson killings, which also did not help the public's perception of what Slipknot stood for and how they were trying, not to be, taken down by committees that thought that they were pushing violence onto the youth. And I just wanted to share it with you because um, the lyrics in this track are actually sampled from an excerpt from Corey Hurst's feature in the 1973 Manson documentary. It's her talking about murder and saying the whole thing, I think it's sick. Um, I'll play a short bit for you just so you can see what I mean. They distorted her voice and they have these like weird droning guitar noises. It's scary.
The whole thing I think is sick. 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 The whole thing I think is sick.
And that's just a little bit of that. I wanted to share it because I think it's interesting, and in doing research for this, um, it's actually about the Manson killings. So I thought that was interesting that they chose to include that. But now I want to bring all of you together by looking at one specific song. And I chose the first, I'm going to say quote unquote, real song in this album. It follows 7426, which I just play for you. It's not Wait and Bleed, and you might be wondering why not Wait and Bleed? That's the Grammy-nominated single, the one that most people know. Here's the thing, it's actually exactly why I'm not choosing it. Wait and Bleed was remixed before release to replace the screamed verses with clean singing. It was softened for radio, and that works against everything I've been arguing about them, that their whole power came from refusing to compromise. Sick, the song I will talk about, was never touched. It's the album in its rawest form. So let's start with the title itself because it's doing a lot of work before you even press play. Sick is S-I-C in parentheses. It's a Latin proofreading term. When you're quoting someone and their words look strange or wrong, you write sick next to it to say, this is not a typo. This is exactly what they said, reproduced word for word. Slipknot naming their opening track that is essentially a statement of intent. They're saying, this is exactly who we are. No corrections, no apologies, take it or leave it. In one 3-letter word, they're preemptively responding to every critic, every parent group, every journalist who wanted to dismiss them, and they're doing it before a single note has been played. That's the kind of thing that separates Slipknot from the bands they were lumped in with. And then I'm going to play about 30 seconds of this song so you can hear the guitars and the intensity that I'm talking about. Right away, you get Sid Wilson's DJ scratching, turntable technique borrowed from straight hip hop. It's laid down over a down-tuned guitar riff that's pulling from death metal and thrash. And underneath all of that, if you listen carefully, there were 3 separate percussionists hitting simultaneously. Joey Jordison on the kit, Sean Cron, and Sven on custom percussion. That means they would use like old kegs to hit on. They would use like brake drums, like actual brakes from vehicles. Custom percussion sounds fancy, but they would literally just hit anything that was loud and had an impact. This altogether can be physically disorienting for some. It creates a wall of rhythm that you feel in your chest before your brain has caught up to what's happening. No other band in 1999 was doing this. This is 9 people performing as a single organism, which goes back to everything we said about collective identity. There's no star here, no guitar hero taking a solo. This is just overwhelming, unified force. And then I'll play for you Corey Taylor, the lead singer, opening his mouth.
Show me what you wanna be. I can handle anything, even if I can't handle you. Better late, either way it better be. Don't you fucking pity me. Get up, get off. What the hell am I
If my grandmother were to hear any of this, she would probably drown me. But that's besides the point. Um, the lyrics here open with pure contempt for social conformity. This is the idea that the world is full of people who aren't paying attention, who aren't feeling anything, and Slipknot has nothing but fury for all of it. This is not the introspective sadness of grunge. Kurt Cobain turned his alienation inward, and it became depression and self-destruction, like I had mentioned before. Slipknot turned theirs outwards, and the anger here isn't a cry for help, it's rather a declaration. And that distinction is what made them speak so loudly to a generation of kids who were tired of being sad about their circumstances and wanted to be furious about them instead. This is where the historical context snaps into focus. Remember, this album was dropped in the summer of 1999, a couple months after Columbine shooting. The country was looking for something to blame for teenage rage, and here was Slipknot in jumpsuits and horror masks, opening their debut album with 9 people screaming simultaneously. The media saw this as a threat. The fans, however, saw this as a mirror. That gap between how the outside world heard the song and how its audience heard it is exactly what makes Sick such a rich text to analyze. It's a song that sounds like chaos, but it's constructed. The title is a deliberate literary reference. The genre fusion is a conscious musical choice. The rage is real, but it's also strategic. And that combination, genuine intensity packed with genuine intelligence, is what changed the landscape, not just for metal, but for what mainstream audiences were willing to accept as rock music at all. Um, Slipknot, I would definitely give some of their the other songs a listen. Sick is definitely one of the most intense ones, but for the sake of showing the rawness and the anger that they portrayed, so I chose that one. But Corey Taylor actually does have a very good singing voice, regardless of what you heard. He's very good at screaming. He actually has a really, really thick neck. Like if you look up a picture of Corey Taylor, he's got a strangely thick neck. Um, yeah, Slipknot is one of my favorite bands. I just I've been listening to them since I was very young, and like I had talked about with how angry teens in the late 90s, early 2000s heard this and related to it because they were tired of being sad. They wanted to be angry. They wanted to do something with that anger. And that's exactly what Slipknot provided for them. And I also related to it very heavily when I was younger. And even now, like I work out to this kind of music. And it truly gets your blood pumping. But well, I hope you all enjoyed this. This is the first episode of Frills and Fury. I'm your host, Emma Jacobs, and I hope to see you next time.